Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar from the Open Group. You're all very welcome, and I'm very pleased to say we have a great speaker today, Martin Owen, who is CEO of Corso, which is a very active member of the Open Group. Before I hand over to Martin, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping issues. Firstly, we would encourage you to ask questions. Obviously, this is a really good opportunity to engage with people like Martin Owen. The best way to submit a question on WebEx is to use the text QA facility. If you do write a question into that facility, please can I ask you to address it to all or all participants. That way everyone gets to see the questions that are being submitted. What we intend to do is we will go through those questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit them as we go through. Also, this event is being fully recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early or if you experience any local technical difficulties, then a full recording will be available, and everyone will get an email which will contain a URL where you can access that recording. I also believe that Martin is making his slide deck available after this presentation, and in the same email that's referred to, there's a URL in there where you can actually download his slides. So Martin, if you're ready, can I hand over to you?
Yep, fine. Great. Okay, so thank you, Simon. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you for taking the time out to come to this presentation. So this is actually a topic I'm very passionate about, and we're going to be covering road mapping and looking at how that applies to both the business world and the IT world, but also how we construct road maps using techniques like ArchiMate and TOGAF. A little bit about myself and where I'm from. So I'm one of the co-founders of Corso. Corso was created in 2011, based out of the UK, also with offices in the US and Australia. I've been an enterprise architect for just over 20 years. My history is with Popkin software, starting off with modeling tools and enterprise architecture tools, primarily a tool called System Architect, which then went from Popkin into Telelogic, which is a Swedish company, and then from Telelogic into IBM. And then at IBM, I became the product director for enterprise architecture, and then moved into a role looking after portfolio management, which was an umbrella term really for strategic planning. So that's really looking at the whole area of taking ideas, prioritizing those ideas, mapping those into enterprise architecture, and then delivering those into business initiatives. So I was responsible really for looking at the tooling around that and how you construct those scenarios. I've played a lot of roles in standards and standards bodies, so I'm doing a lot of work now at the Open Group. So I'm leading now the committee and the team on defining mappings between enterprise architecture with ArchiMate and UML, the Unified Modeling Language from the OMG. So at Corso, we're both active within the Open Group and the OMG, and I also helped create the standard for business process modeling, which is the Business Process Modeling Notation, BPMN. Okay, a little bit about Corso. As I mentioned, we're back in 2011, we were created. We were created from the former IBM product team for System Architect. So we do understand tools very well, and we understand how to fit tools together. We also understand lots of the methods and frameworks behind those tools, including things like DODAF, TOGAF, MODAF, obviously ArchiMate, which we're heavily involved in now. And we created the company to actually start to look at how we address the disconnect between EA teams and the rest of the business. And that's really what we're focusing on. And this is why we really see road mapping as being extremely important to be able to communicate information in our architecture to the right stakeholders in an organization. So we have a global network. Obviously, we have our own offices. We have a network of associates and expertise throughout the world. We're also premium IBM business partners. So we do resell IBM tooling. We put our own tools into that tooling to add value. And we provide that both on a product basis, but also on a cloud. So quite uniquely, we're able to offer a lot of the rational products from IBM on our cloud, so you can actually rent those on a monthly basis. So what are we going to talk about today? So I'm going to give you a little overview on what road mapping is about, how we've been working with it, what it means, some of the core concepts behind a roadmap, so what types of things should you be interested in, the capabilities or techniques that you need to understand that help you create both strategic, business and IT roadmaps. We'll have a look at the supporting meta model. So this is vitally important because to be able to construct consistent roadmaps, you need to understand a meta model. So you need to understand how to create a model that can give you repeatable domain roadmaps, capability roadmaps, IT roadmaps. Then we'll have a look at specific viewpoints or views of architecture, which help you understand things over time. And then lastly, we'll look at lessons we've learned. And these are lessons we've learned in various projects, various initiatives, various pieces of work that we've been doing over the last 20 years. So hopefully for you, it's going to be a little bit of education for you. I'm sure out there as well, you've got ideas as well. So hopefully you can link into me on LinkedIn, link into Corso. We can start to share some of these concepts and feed those back into groups like the Open Group. Okay, so we've been working with a number of customers. Now, the customers we work with, normally they are strategic, yet large customers. They're around the globe, so they're in every country. Every organization that we're talking to at some level is managing initiatives around roadmaps. And roadmaps are really the output that the organization sees. So these are really the things that need to be looked at from an enterprise architecture perspective. So lots of organizations are building roadmaps in PowerPoint and Excel. They're hard work. They have to be reinvented every time and repopulated. Enterprise architecture gives us a basis for building roadmaps in a formal manner, in a structured manner, and in a repeatable way. Now, roadmaps take a number of forms. So we can build roadmaps to show off the business strategy. We can build roadmaps just to show individual projects or programs of work. We can look at different life cycles. I'll explain what those are as we move through. And then obviously technology and application roadmaps. Now, out of the box, if you take something like TOGAF or ArchiMate, then they both need to be enhanced to support full road mapping. So some of the concepts we're going to be talking about in this presentation are not in the core TOGAF or ArchiMate specifications. And that's part of the work that we're doing with Corso within the Open Group to promote some of these capabilities. So one of the most important things, one of the biggest lessons that we've learned over time is that building architecture for architecture's sake doesn't get you very far. So you need to go in to build architecture with a reason in mind, and roadmaps are a great reason of why you should be doing architecture. And in fact, roadmaps are used both in enterprise architecture to explain where architecture is on some time horizon, and they're also used as part of portfolio management for discussing the costs, the resources, and the risk behind the architecture. So roadmaps can be viewed by various stakeholders in the organization. They don't need to understand TOGAF or ArchiMate to look at a roadmap and to understand it. So what we do is we lead with roadmaps. So we demonstrate a roadmap, what it looks like. We show the attributes or the properties that are required to create those roadmaps. And then we discuss enterprise architecture and portfolio management and how they can be used to support the process of creating roadmaps. And at the end of the day, this is about doing things in a formal manner, and it's about doing things in a cost-efficient manner and in a repeatable manner. So let's have a little look at TOGAF. So what you're looking at on the right-hand side here is the TOGAF ADM. And this is really a process or a method for constructing enterprise architecture. So it's a set of guidelines and a set of principles. And there's various iterations you'll go through when you're actually planning out your architectures. And these are demonstrated with the loops that we've got on the screen. So we'll go through some context iterations. So the reason why we're building architecture. So we'll set up the vision and the strategy. On the right-hand side of the wheel, you've got B, C, D, and E. So we're actually looking at creating the architectures themselves. We go through iterations and life cycles of creating architectures. Importantly, if you look at the bottom there for E and F, we talk about opportunities and solutions. So why we're doing things, what projects are we going to kick off, what programs of work, and migration planning in F is how we're going to actually get to build those pieces of work from where we are today. So these are two important areas, E and F, certainly where roadmaps can help, and they're also an area where frameworks like ArchiMate and ArchiMate 2 is coming into its own. So ArchiMate 2 helps us with a lot of views around building a roadmap and building a transition plan. They do not give us roadmaps themselves, and I'll show you later why. So some of the techniques on the left-hand side we're looking at here. So enterprise architecture modeling, looking at business strategy, process, organizational structure, locations, data, applications or systems and technology. These are important types of things to be developed and built. We're obviously interested in documentation and reporting on those aspects. What's interesting about all of those aspects is that they can all have time applied to them. So we can put time on a business process. It can have a start and end date of when that business process starts or ends. We can put application components having start and end dates on them. Similarly with technology, similarly with capabilities. Any part of our architecture can have temporal properties associated with them. When we look at change within the ADM on the right-hand side, those iterations of change are much slower than they are in the software development world. So if we're doing code changes in the software world, it's very different to putting change into a governance process around enterprise architecture. So that means that we handle things in a slightly different way when we're going through change. And that also affects our roadmaps. That actually drives how we build roadmaps. One of the other things we do when we look at strategic planning is we look at the life cycle here of change, but we also look at that in the context of different options and different recommendations and different initiatives. Okay, so again, it's very different to the software world where people are used to merging and branching. So the main output from what we do in this environment is an architectural blueprint. And in fact, roadmaps themselves are blueprints within an organization. They're how we see the world with time applied to it. So how do we transition and decide between different blueprints and what we're going to choose as we move forward in terms of options? Well, we need to look at timelines and roadmaps as well as the current EA techniques. We also need to look at costs over time as well, and that's an important dimension to road mapping. So if we look at different implementation migration patterns, these are pretty important. So I mentioned a lot of the work around roadmaps. You're concerning yourself with migration planning and implementation and governance inside TOGAF. We're also concerned with opportunities and solutions. So what we're seeing here on the screen is an example of, on the left-hand side here, we may start off with an EA version 1.2. This is our baseline enterprise architecture view of the world. That could be our current state. And then we can have at the bottom here, you'll see set constraints and define guidelines. So this could be a program of work that comes in where we look at implementing a new business process. Now, what we can do at the top there is create X and Y, and these could be alternative options. So these could be target states. So we have our current architecture, which shows our processes, locations, organizational structure, data, technology, etc. We can provide different options of that, X and Y, and then decide that Y is the option we're going to choose and create a new baseline architecture called version 1.3. And from that baseline, that's the baseline we can publish to our organization. And then from that, we can then start to look at if we have maybe an outsourcing initiative that comes in, we can then start to look at alternatives A and B. And then from B, we can branch off into B2 and B1. So those could be different proposals or evaluations for change in our organisation, for outsourcing. So this is very high level. And then from EA version 1.3 down to D at the bottom there, yeah, we could just collect and incorporate feedback. So this could be something like we want to undertake an application portfolio management or rationalisation exercise. So we can survey the rest of the organisation, get feedback about which applications are important and which ones aren't, who the owners are, what the capability is being used for. And from D, we can then decide we're going to create a refresh and create version 2 of our enterprise architecture. We don't have to use options B2 and B1. And then from V2 here of the architecture, we might have an acquisition that we go through. So we're going to use our EA to look at how we're going to migrate business processes and capabilities from another organisation, along with the technology infrastructure that's there. And we're going to create Y. So that gives you an example of the different types of migration patterns we've got when we're looking at things over time. And it's important to have this context as we move forward inside the presentation. So quite often people refer to this as current state versus future state architectures. Some people call it a federated architecture, as is to be. There's lots of different terminology for this. The second slide here shows a very simple as is versus to be scenario. This time what you'll see is that from version 1.3 we create an alternative X and an alternative Y, both with different types of capabilities and different types of architecture and differences. And based on increased revenue in Y, we decide that's our chosen path forward. Okay, so again, just examples of how you'd use as is and to be architectures. Okay, so when we talk about road mapping, I'll show you some different types of road mapping. Road mapping covers a wide spectrum of views and information. So these are the things that are important when you look at the concept of a roadmap. So starting off on the left-hand side here, we've got something called a plateau. And a plateau is available in both TOGAF and ArchiMate. Previously, before plateaus were available, a long time ago, we referred to these types of things as workspaces or partitions. Gaps are important, and I'm going to take you through each of these concepts as we go through the presentation. Gaps are important in that they let you look at how you're going to get from one state to another, how you're going to transition from A to B. A workspace or plateau represents a piece of architecture or a well-defined group of architectural assets at a particular moment in time. A gap is the gap between one set of plateaus and another. Work packages are units of work. So these are things that we'll do, and they will help us get from one plateau to another plateau via a gap. And a work package could be a project, it could be a complete program of work, it could be an individual task, it could be a complete exercise, but a work package is a unit of work with a start and end date. Again, work packages are part of ArchiMate. You can model them, you can look at them in views. Another concept here is a milestone. So a milestone is not in ArchiMate and is not in TOGAF. But a milestone is really a specific gateway or a specific moment in time in a work package timeline that allows you to get from A to B. So normally a work package will be made up of specific milestones that you want to hit to ensure that you're on target and that you're making the transition to the end date of that work package. And a milestone will normally have a delivery date. So a milestone might be something like gather requirements, specify design, build product, test product. So anything can have a set of milestones. Any piece of work should have a set of milestones. And then we've got life cycles. So life cycles allow us to specify the behavior of any piece of our architecture at any moment in time. So it's really the lifecycle state. So is it in service or out of service? Is it sunset? Is it being prototyped? Is it being delivered as a piece of training? So every organisation that I've spoken to has their own set of lifecycle states, and even within their company, they have different lifecycle states representing the type of work that they're doing, and the life cycles have meaning to them. And the lifecycle states themselves are something you need to standardise. So when you look at road mapping and different types of road mapping, quite often things like application portfolio management will have a well-defined set of states that you'll go through to manage your application portfolio. Things like components and versions are important. So as you move your architecture over time, be able to create a set of components, architectural components that sit together and have a version is important in terms of how you baseline things moving forward. So if you create an alternative X versus an alternative Y, having an understanding of what the baseline components and versions are is important. And the other big driver on here is costs. And this might be in terms of resource costs. It might be in terms of work package costs. There's a whole range of costs that affect what you do. So again, we'll hit some of these concepts as we move further through the presentation. Now this slide here shows us some of the important capabilities for road mapping. If you're looking at tooling, these are things you should be able to do with your tooling. If the tooling doesn't do these types of things automatically, it'll be more difficult for you to construct roadmaps. Obviously, the first thing we're concerned with here is compare. So if we're looking at current state versus future state, we want to see the differences between those two states. If we're looking at alternative X versus alternative Y, what are the differences between the two? If we're looking at merging two organizations, we need to difference them. So be able to compare is very important. The other aspect to road mapping is looking at heat maps. So how do we understand the state of something over time? A good way of doing that is either by color coding it, so using red, amber, green, so RAG status indicators, or visually changing the shape of things, or changing the depictions of things over time. So be able to run analytics against roadmaps and model content is crucial. As I mentioned, version management, that's important. Understanding which versions we're on so we can track the history. And that links into audit trailing. Being able to look at who's done what, who's changed what over time, which is linked to why people change things. So we need to understand that behavior in order to build a roadmap. And the other thing we put onto here is impact assessment. So what's the impact of changing something? So again, although the roadmap might show us some detail, we need to be able to drill into that roadmap and look at the impact of a milestone being delayed or implementing one architecture versus another architecture. Looking at the impact is crucial in terms of looking at the impact of change. Okay, so most things that we do, most things that we change are driven by business motivation. So business motivation is driving the need for us to change things. Business motivation tells us that we need to create a current state versus future state, or alternative X or alternative Y. So both TOGAF and ArchiMate have ways to model business motivation. So TOGAF uses the business motivation model. ArchiMate also has its business motivation built into it as well. You can also look at requirements for change. So the ADM wheel that we looked at a few slides ago, right at the heart of that was a requirements piece. So you can model requirements for change. You can also track them. So if you're going into what we call an enterprise requirements environment, you can use specific requirements management tools to manage the traceability between requirements. So those requirements do change. You may want to track them as a discipline in their own right, and you can use tools to do that. In response to what you're going to change, you can model the change and describe the change in a work package. And then roadmaps themselves, these are the anticipated or the actual timeline of change that's required to any particular asset in your architecture. So all a roadmap is showing us something over a specific time period. And again, we'll have a look at that as we move through. So, as I mentioned, business motivation modeling is important. A really nice thing about ArchiMate, ArchiMate now supports the concept of work packages, gaps, and requirements, and all these can be seen graphically through a view. And what we've done is we've extended ArchiMate with specific support for workspace management and requirements management. So let's have a look at the simple TOGAF meta model. So at the top here, you can see requirements, gaps, and work packages. And they're associated with all objects. Okay, so they're associated with processes, locations, data, applications, technology components, platforms, etc. So those concepts already exist. So let's have a look at the standard ArchiMate meta model. So this is a snippet of the model itself. So the items in a yellow colour on here, you'll see that there's a plateau on the left-hand side, which is associated with a gap. That realises deliverables. Deliverables realise work packages. And what we've added into this concept is the concept of a work package milestone. So a work package can use work package milestones. Work package milestones themselves can deliver, they can be gates to deliver pieces of work that can go to one or many work packages. We've also got the concept on here of Plateau linking to Workspace. That's really a physical implementation. So obviously one of the things we do at Corso is we support tooling, and a Workspace is a tooling capability inside IBM's rational system architecture. It supports workspaces and dividing things up into partitions. Okay, but it really maps to a Plateau. So this is how we've extended the meta model. So what is a workspace? So a workspace is really a container of artifacts. So it brings together a complete meta model, but it brings together a set of model information for a particular moment in time. It spans across all modeling domains. So we can use a workspace for a number of things. We can use it as a dedicated project. We can use it for as-is and to-be architectures. We can use a workspace to sandbox things, so go and play with something to test out an idea to see if it works or not. We can baseline a workspace, and the workspace itself is the root, or baseline the workspace is the root of other workspaces. So we can use it for do some detailed comparison later on. And any changes in workspace we can associate with things like change requests, so we can manage things in a governance lifecycle. I'm not going to spend too much time on workspaces, but a workspace is now really akin to a plateau, as I described earlier on. Now, ArchiMate itself has a nice implementation and migration view. So you probably can't see this example that clearly on the screen. But again, we do have a white paper on the Corso website which allows you to go in and download and have a look at some examples. But we can put models into ArchiMate and look at the viewpoint as an implementation and migration diagram. As I mentioned, plateaus represent workspaces. So the boxes that you're seeing, the cubes on the screen here, are plateaus. And the gaps between those plateaus we can model. And we can also model things like deliverables and work packages associated with deliverables. So the interesting thing here is that this implementation and migration view can actually document your repository or workspace or plateau structure for how you're building your enterprise architecture. So I'm quite passionate about this. I think every time we should do a piece of enterprise architecture work, we need to make sure, as an organisation, we're mapping out our implementation and migration viewpoint to describe our different architectural plateaus, or different workspaces, or different packages of work. So we can build them with a model view, we can describe them, and we're using ArchiMate to describe how we're documenting our enterprise architecture strategy. Okay, work packages represent discrete pieces of work. They have a start and end date. Work packages aren't necessarily projects. They can be, but they can represent pieces of work at different levels in the organisation. We're doing a lot of work ourselves of mapping work packages into programs, so you can talk to the PMO or the Program Management Office about things, and we can actually break down work packages inside ArchiMate as well. And we can add milestones into these. So again, as I mentioned before, milestones show us the status or the gates for given pieces of work. We then got a timeline. So a timeline is a new view. Okay, now, what we've done here, there are a lot of standards out there. So what we've tried to do is reuse things where possible rather than reinvent the wheel. So in MODAF, an early version of MODAF, I think it's MODAF 1.1, which is the Ministry of Defence Architectural Framework in the UK, they had something called an ACV2. An ACV2 is an acquisition view. And the acquisition view showed a timeline of work packages in a very nice way. That view was then reused in DODAF 2, so it's now part of DODAF 2, the Department of Defence Architectural Framework. So we've taken that and reused that and renamed what were system entities into projects, and we've renamed milestones. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So this is what it looks like. So moving horizontally down the page here, square boxes on the left-hand side are our work packages. If you remember, these can be projects, programs, tasks, anything that we like on here. We show those going down the screen. At the bottom of the page here, we have a time bar or a time legend that's showing us time going from left to right. In this instance, we're looking at 2011 to 2013. So we're always looking at time going from left to right in this example. The pies, the large pies that you see on the screen, are what we call milestones. So they're milestones that represent the gateways for a particular work package. Okay, so they're automatically plotted out for us along the timeline. We can show dependencies between those milestones as well. So if one milestone relies on another being complete, we can represent that. The milestones themselves represent dates or moments in time. Now we've also got on there, notice that we've got segments to the pie. So that's important. Okay, so the segments to the pie can be configured yourselves. And they just represent status. Okay, so there are lots of different ways you can set status. We've put a few in there as an example. So things like we've got cost. Is it high, medium, low, or it's not required? Resource, high, medium, low, or unknown. And whether it's strategic or not. Whether it's high strategic importance, medium, low. But there are lots of other statuses you can put in there. The more statuses you add to a milestone, the more segments you get to the pie. Okay, so examples on there are things like MOD gates. It could be lines of business and their status, like have you organised training at that milestone? Have you delivered tests to the test people? Have you QA'd? Have you done whatever? So those are configurable. We can also associate cost as well. Now, costs we can associate not just with things like milestones, but also with the complete work package itself, and also with deliverables that are affected by those work packages, so things you're delivering at the end of the day. You can also obviously import costs in, because you may not be managing cost in your enterprise architecture environment, So it's vitally important you've got access to some of those costings, either in project management tools or portfolio management tools, or just from Excel. Okay, so I mentioned life cycles earlier on. So life cycles are really important. So when we look at modeling and we look at as-is and to-be architectures, looking at plateaus on their own and looking at work packages and milestones isn't enough. So what we need to do is we need to look at each plateau in its entirety and have a look at the life cycles of particular meta objects in our architecture, and what they're doing over time. So life cycles show us the life cycle states that an object moves through over time. Life cycles may also relate to milestones. I'll show you some examples of this in a second. But let's just say, for example, we take an application component. And we look at an application component, so it might be Salesforce.com. So we're going to introduce Salesforce.com into our organization. So it's got a plan date, a plan start date, and a plan end date. It might have an implementation date, start and end date, a deployment start and end date, and then when we expect to retire it. So those could be example life cycles that we've got inside our architecture. For each one of those pieces of work for the life cycle, like implement, that can be connected to a work package with a series of milestones that kicks off that work. So you can start to see now how this is all integrated with each other to give you a complete view of time. So let's have a little look at TOGAF and what we've done to extend TOGAF. So I'm showing you a little bit behind the scenes here in terms of the meta model, so you can start to get an understanding for why the views are created and how they're created. So I mentioned before at the bottom here, the things in a very light blue, plateaus, deliverables, work packages we've discussed, and gaps, and that Workspace was a IBM Rational System Architect concept that's very much akin to a plateau. And that we brought in purple here, the concept of a work package milestone. So a work package may have work package milestones. And what we've now said is that a work package milestone may relate to a life cycle state. So let's take a look at life cycle state and what that is. Now what you'll see is that life cycle in this meta model here, we've connected to various objects in the meta model. This isn't a finite set. So you can put other things in here. So almost everything that's inside our enterprise architecture in terms of meta objects, it can have time associated with them and can have a life cycle state associated with them. So here we map to capability, application component, technology component, business process, and location. But we could do other things as well. Okay, so it could be that we're interested in looking at data. It could be that data has a life cycle status. Okay, and a life cycle state represents a life cycle. I'll talk about the difference between the two of those in a second. Suffice to say that a life cycle state could be something, as I mentioned, like sunset. It could be deployed, etc. And those map into the other concepts within TOGAF. So, as Corso, we've been doing this for a long time. So, yeah, we have a library of life cycles. However, as I mentioned before, most organizations have their own life cycles and synonyms. Even within organizations, this often happens. You have one team calling a life cycle retired, and another one calling it sunset. Okay, so one of the things we do is we ship with it, so life cycles. You can customize these and create your own life cycles. I'm not referring too much to tooling inside here. You can look at tooling on our website if you want to, but we do ship life cycles with our tools. So here's the examples of the things that we support. We have two types of life cycles. We have deployment life cycles. So these are really things that you're physically deploying. And these tend to be, you might physically deploy a business process. You might physically deploy an application component or a technology component. You might physically deploy a location. So the phases they go through, or life cycles they go through, are birth, planning, implementation, production, retired. people on this call will have their own. They will have more, they will have less. So there are no set of standards on here yet. The other part on here is usage life cycles. So how are we going to use those enterprise architecture assets? And this normally comes down to a business viewpoint. So again, if I'm looking at an application component or a technology component, or even a business process, I might go to the life cycles of, we're going to plan it from a business perspective, we're going to train people up, then we're going to make it available to our users, then we're going to decommission it, and then we're going to sunset it. So what you're seeing here is that I've put up there two different types of life cycles, deployment life cycles and usage life cycles. And you can more or less split those into deploying is about physically deploying things, and usage is about using them. So you really start to get an IT perspective and a business perspective on the usage of things. So this is a TOGAF view on here. So here we're looking at application components as an example. And we're mapping life cycles to particular applications. So again, if you look at salesforce.com there, it's got birth, implement, plan, production, retired as life cycles. The things on the left-hand side are deployment life cycles. The things on the right-hand side, the list on the right-hand side, are usage life cycles. So how the business is looking to use them. So you can see the terminology can be slightly different. But we've got this idea of life cycles, and life cycle types. And what we could do on here, as I mentioned before, heat mapping is crucially important. So once I've got this information in here, what I'm looking to do is to then look for anomalies in my architecture, in my views. So here we're looking at heat mapping, the same things. This is a 2014 viewpoint. So one thing to remember is that each of these life cycles has a start and end date. So a start and end date for when we deploy it, for when it's born, when we plan it, when we put it into production. They all have start and end dates. So if the date ends up within 2014, this is an analytic, then if production is within 2014, the object turns green. If it's in a planning life cycle for 2014, it's amber. And if it's in a red, it's retired. So retired as a life cycle is in 2014. That's from a deployment viewpoint. On the right-hand side of the legend there, you'll see things like available, training, and sunset. So what you'll see there is that we've got different pen styles for our shapes. So if it's available, it's got a solid pen, a dotted pen for training, and a thick pen for sunset. So what you're starting to see here is by applying analytics for both deployment and usage life cycles, you can start to look for anomalies between when things are being deployed and when they're planned to be used. Okay, so I can see automatically here that HubSpot, for example, on here, in 2014 is in production, and it's available, which is a good thing. Okay, I can see that Salesforce.com in 2014 is going through a planning life cycle and a training life cycle, which could be a good thing as well. I can see there's a bad thing for Concrete 5. It's in planning, but it's also available for usage, according to the business people. So there's an anomaly here that we need to discuss and work out. So that's a little bit of an example of how you use heat mapping on life cycle states. Then we talk about plateaus. Okay, so coming back to the idea of a plateau. So a plateau is a self-contained unit or piece of architecture that is used to describe, again, current state, future state, alternative architectures. So here, in this example, we've got an example of the architecture state as in 2014 and the architecture as in 2015, which is the green box. And inside those boxes, we've got different views of our heat maps. So we've got different views of the life cycle states for 2013, 14, 15, 16 within each plateau. And that's important because you may have a different view of what the architecture looks like in 2014 than 2015, and the life cycle states within the model may reflect that. They may be different. So you want to be able to compare across those time slices in different plateaus. So quite quickly, this can get quite complex unless you start to understand and start to map this out with thought up front before you start tackling anything like plateaus, gaps, etc. Okay, now to give you an idea of an overall roadmap, what does an overall roadmap look like? Okay, so we talked a lot about life cycles. We've talked a lot about architecture. So this is an example of a roadmap. It's one we actually ship with our tool set. It's represented inside both Excel, and we also ship it with HTML5, so you can look at this on an iPad. One of the great things about putting this type of view into an iPad is that you can then show it to an exec. You can show it to somebody that's not familiar with architecture in any shape or form, and they'll understand it. So let me show you how this builds up and what it's showing you. So this is actually mapping into TOGAF. So this is actually a TOGAF model now being shown in a view which is very much a business-oriented view that most stakeholders could understand. So on the top bar here, we have an organizational unit. So this represents an org unit inside TOGAF. At the bottom of the screen, on the left-hand side, you've got a list of the related business services to that org unit. We've got mapping from the org unit to the milestones inside here. So one of the other things we put into our mapping, I did not show you inside our meta model, is that an org unit and the roles within that org unit can be responsible for work packages and milestones. So we can show the milestones that relate to that org unit here. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, we've also put in there risks and issues. What are the risks and issues the org unit are concerned with? And then in the middle of the screen here is our timeline. So it's going from, in this example here, 2012 all the way through to 2022 in quarterly chunks. And what we're showing here is our set of application components which represent the rows, or represented by the rows. And the first cell on there is we can put selected attributes in the first column. So, and this corresponds to the key at the top. So the top right-hand corner has a key which says strategic, yes or no. And then if it's yes, it colours in the green box next to the application component as being strategic. If it's not, it's just red. We've got a cost column in the legend which says it's less than 5 million, it's green. If it's greater than 5 million, less than 10, it's yellow. If it's greater than 10 million, it's red. That corresponds to the cost cell. There are some others in there as well. But moving across into the lifecycle states now, you'll see there's different colours on the timeline. And in the roadmap key at the top, you'll see there's birth, planning, implementation, production, retired. And what we're doing here automatically is mapping out those lifecycle states, which you saw, for example, in the application components, directly into this roadmap. And these application components are the application components that are related to the business services, which relate to the organizational unit. Okay, so that's really how you'd represent a roadmap to end users. This is a great way of displaying it. And we can do this for anything. We can do it for technology components. We can show business capabilities in a timeline like this. Okay, another way of showing roadmaps. So again, remembering that roadmap is associated with time, is looking at what we call a side-by-side view of our architecture. So quite often people want to look at things visually, and certainly from a more technical community, you may want to see things that are related to each other. So you may want to say in 2013, yeah, the view is this. In 2014, I see we've got rid of some components, or I've added components in, and also how they're related to each other. You may want to show how things migrate from one state to another. Again, we can use colors. We can use the side-by-side view here to get a good view of our architecture over time. You do start to limit yourself here the more you want to start to look at things in terms of going out 10 years, in terms of a side-by-side view of 10 things. It becomes more difficult. Another popular way of looking at a roadmap is just to time slice it. So take a view of the model. This model could be across plateaus as well, by the way. And saying, okay, I want to use a timer bar. And a timer bar is the bar that you're seeing at the top of the screen here. I'll be able to set a start and end date to that. And then look at everything that's either in service or out of service, or applies to a particular life cycle, but show it within a slider bar and have things fade in or out. So you're getting a snapshot at a moment in time based upon a life cycle. So that's just another popular view. Okay, then moving forward, as you move more into strategic planning, you then need to start looking at roadmaps in terms of how you connect up both the enterprise architecture community and the portfolio management community. So you can then start to look at taking resources, taking assets, moving those across into a full-blown portfolio management environment, including moving life cycles across the states of things, application components, resources, org units, and putting those into a tool where you can start to look at things like benefits realization, applying resource to those. You can also look at formally managing change across a wide group of people. So that's also important in terms of managing roadmaps and managing time. So again, I'm not going to push too heavily on the tooling support here. Suffice to say, there are lots of tools that can do this type of thing. So in terms of Corso, what lessons have we learnt with roadmaps? So roadmaps drive real value from the architecture. So when you were looking at the spreadsheet view earlier on and the side-by-side views, those are the types of things that the business community and certainly IT leaders want to see in terms of value from the architecture. They don't want to see a massive 5,000 models, okay, and you telling them how hard it has been to construct those models. You need to show them the value of the architecture. Roadmaps are a good way to do that. Also showing analytics and heat maps are another good way. Mapping out a repository strategy. So I mentioned that earlier on. ArchiMate makes a great, or adds great value to you in terms of the implementation and migration view in allowing you to map out that strategy. If you don't start to map out the repository strategy quite early on, you start to get into either one repository with lots of information that's really hard to work through and it becomes unmanageable, or you end up with lots of repositories that you have no idea what they were created for in the first place. Decide on a common set of terms for lifecycle states. Okay, so we give you the ability to handle synonyms inside our tooling, but you need to decide on a common set of terms, because when you communicate and when you run analytics, it's easier to run analytics on one single set of lifecycle states. Mentioned before, temporal states or time properties can be added to any object inside ArchiMate and TOGAF. So you can start to look at roadmaps for anything at all. So it could be business strategy. So you could do things like look at the enterprise direction diagram inside TOGAF and start to say, right, this business objective, which I've been asked to put in place and model, isn't going to come into place until 2021. So you can put that into a tool, and you can timeline that in a roadmap. You also want to understand how, when you start talking about time and roadmaps, you really need to start talking to the portfolio management community within the organization, because this is where the overlap starts to come in between enterprise architecture and portfolio management. And you can drive a lot of value by getting those teams to talk to each other through the use of roadmaps. And the big lesson here is that make sure your output is being presented inside a tool, or the output is in something like Office that the execs or the operational staff or the consumers or stakeholders in the organization can use and can understand. So don't frighten them off by showing them a modeling tool in a live environment. Okay, so those are some of the lessons learned. I just want to finish up before we take questions with, if you want further information, there are white papers on our website. If you want to play with tooling, we have 30-day trials where you can either use the software locally yourselves, or you can just log onto our cloud. It's very quick for us to set you guys up with the cloud and the SaaS environment, and it's corso3.com. Okay, so on that note, I'm just going to thank you for attending and open up to Simon to take questions.
That's great, Martin. Many thanks for that extremely interesting insight into road mapping. Yes, we had some questions in, and if you would like to ask Martin a question, please do write that question into the QA facility now. I just want to track back a little bit in the chat at the moment, Martin, because there was a really interesting question coming in very early on, but I need to see if I can find it very quickly. the gentleman was asking, they've been running enterprise architecture projects in Basel in Switzerland, and he represents the company in the US where they'd like to replicate that work. And he was just asking, do you have any advice of how you can go about leveraging other people's road mapping work from location to location?
That's interesting. Okay, so the work we've done so far, and we have a really good case study on the work we've been doing with IBM themselves. They have lots of geographies, and that plays really well into things like plateaus. So you can create plateaus of work for different geographies. So if there's road mapping work that's been done already, if it's been done in a tool that's the same tool that you're using, it makes life easier. It doesn't have to be, but you can certainly model it as a plateau and then start to reuse that work in your plateaus moving forward. So I would suggest create a implementation migration view and start to map their work.
Great, thank you, Martin. Question here from Anil. He's asking, I understand about EA, but can you please elaborate the place of portfolio management in lead with road mapping?
Okay. So portfolio management really allows us to look at the programs of work that we've got on the go, but also to look at things like the priorities, so we can look at the prioritization of those pieces of work. Also, it's more about the resources that are available and working out when best to implement those programs of work. So it's more about the resource management side, the budgeting and the prioritization, than the technical architecture. So where road mapping fits in is if you understand time from an enterprise architecture perspective of when you expect things from an enterprise architecture perspective to be in place, then you can communicate that to the PMO world, the program management world, so that they can actually make better plans than they had been able to previously. So it's very much complementary.
Excellent. Okay, I've got a question here from Philip, just asking a specific question about one of your slides, slide 16. He's saying, please can you explain what you mean by a frozen snapshot with pre-populated content?
Okay, I'll probably not try, let me see if I can find that slide for you. I can certainly talk about it. So, yeah, so effectively what you can do is you can take a plateau of work. So you might create a 2015 piece of work. You can then decide that that's going to be your current state architecture, so you can baseline it. You can then freeze it, yeah, and that's what we call a frozen baseline, yeah, or you can freeze it like a snapshot, like you do with a VMware image, and then you can move on to creating another plateau of work based upon that frozen snapshot. It means that nobody else can change the previous 2015 baseline, but any work you do is in addition to what you've done previously. Does that make sense?
Lovely, thank you, Martin. And just a question here, just to clarify the roles of ArchiMate to TOGAF. And he's saying, is the advantage of ArchiMate over TOGAF in strategic road mapping is that it provides structured tools with specific concepts? Okay.
Well, I would say slightly differently to that. So the benefit of ArchiMate is it gives you a visual notation for which to look at the views of the architecture with, which TOGAF doesn't give you. So TOGAF gives you a life cycle. It tells you what objects you should create, what types of views you should create, but doesn't tell you what they should look like. ArchiMate does less on the telling you how you should create things and more on what the view should look like. So they're actually quite complementary. In terms of road mapping, ArchiMate gives you a lot because it gives you the idea of modeling and visualizing work packages, gaps, plateaus, and deliverables, which you don't really get visually inside TOGAF.
Okay, Martin, well, I'm looking at the time. I think we're now coming to the allotted end of the presentation, so I think this would be a good opportunity to call it a day. If we haven't managed to get to any questions, please feel free to send them through to myself. I know that Martin would be more than happy to answer any questions offline. At this point, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's presentation. Martin, I'd really like to thank you for your time. I think it's been a very insightful presentation. And please do keep an eye out on the Open Group website for future webinars. So, Martin, you'd like to just final word?
Yep. So thank you for all taking your time out today. Again, please feel free to forward any questions to Simon. I'm happy to answer anything for you.
That's brilliant. Many thanks, everyone.
Thank you.